Thank you, Carrie, for sharing the scriptures with us today. Will you please pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Good morning. I want to thank Pastor David for inviting me to speak with you all today. For those of you who I have not met, my name is Tricia Grafelman, and I am the lay leader here at the Heart of Longmont. My mother, Donna Dudley, was a United Methodist clergy, and she passed away a little over 5 years ago. On this All Saints Sunday, I am honored to be able to share with you one of her sermons. This message is a combination of some of my thoughts as well as my mother's. As I was reading through the multitude of my mother's sermons, this title, To Be or Not to Be Judgmental, caught my eye. She wrote it in 1996, the year that my daughter, Elaine, was born. And her words ring as true today as they did then. Partly, I chose it because of the time of year, when we are called to be judgmental about candidates and issues. We hear judgment soaring over the TV and over the radio. But mostly, I chose it because I struggle with being judgmental myself. It's nearly impossible not to be judgmental about something. Every single person has their own opinions, which can easily turn into judgment when others don't have the same opinion. 2 years ago, I interviewed a few people from my hometown of Gothenburg, Nebraska, to learn a little bit more about my dad. He had passed away when I was 8, and since I never got to know him as an adult, I was curious to know what other adults remembered about him. I compiled the interviews and shared them with my brothers and their families last year. I heard several common themes about my dad. Almost every single person talked about his pipe, his incredible work ethic, his ability to see things from another viewpoint, which they told me made him a good president of the school board, and how accepting he was of others. Some of you have gotten to know my mother when she was here. She led both the Children and Family Ministry Leadership Team retreat, as well as a family retreat at Buckhorn Camp. She joined our Adventurers Sunday School, as well as went to some of the UMW events. She had some strong opinions. She wasn't judgmental about all things, but about some things for sure. She taught all of her children, almost to a fault, to look at every issue from another point of view. If her emotional self allowed her to be judgmental, then her intellectual self knew that it was just as important to consider all sides of a topic. I can't decide if I should blame or thank her for that. I do know that it has made my own children very furious with me at times. When they're upset about a certain someone or something, I inevitably chime in with, well, you have to think about it from the other point of view. My girls just want me to be angry on their behalf, not wishy-washy. So sometimes I can't decide where I land on an issue. But sometimes, when I know in my gut what is right, I then judge those who don't see it the same way as I do. I have a split personality, sometimes knowing exactly what I believe and what is right, and then not so sure, seeing it from the other point of view. Carrie Hickman read both from Romans 2 and from Romans 14. The following is what my mom, Donna Dudley, has to say about these scriptures. The Bible also has a split personality about making judgments. Sometimes it talks about dividing the goats from the sheep. In the Old Testament, it tells us not to eat with unbelievers and warns us against unbelievers marrying believers. And that's about as judgmental as you can get. But in Romans 14, Paul tells us plain and clear we are not to be judgmental. Now, if you remember, what you ate was a big deal to the Jews of that time. The dietary laws were very strict and inflexible and complicated. No pork, no meat, and milk together. And the Jews believed that you could not be a good Jew or even a good person if you were not an observing Jew. That meant obeying over 900 laws, every single one of them, every single time. But Paul says it's no big deal. If you eat anything, it's okay. If you're a vegetarian, it's okay. If you eat nothing at all and want to fast, it's okay. But what is not okay is to pass judgment on those who eat differently than you do. Then Paul refers to the commandment that tells us to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And that's okay, says Paul, if we observe the day in honor of the Lord. And it's even okay not to observe the Sabbath day strictly, to treat all the days more or less the same. But what is not okay is to make judgment of those whose opinions differ from yours. Now that's exactly what I want to believe, says my mother, and she continues. I have a tendency to be judgmental only of judgmental people. I have little sympathy with racists, or with those who put down homosexuals, or with those who criticize the poor, or with those who think that youth are wild and foolish, or with those who say out loud that anyone who does not believe the way that I do are not really Christians. Of course, what that really means is that I do end up being judgmental. Maybe just as judgmental of those whom I am labeling as self-righteous. And so I struggle with the question, as we all do if we're honest, to be or not to be judgmental. When is it right to separate the sheep from the goats? When is it my right and my responsibility to help you see that this is right and this is wrong? And when is it absolutely, positively wrong to be judgmental? When do we follow Paul's advice and let anything go? He tells us not to quarrel over opinions, to welcome anyone and everyone into our churches. I used to worry about Tricia when she was in high school. That's me. Because she was so judgmental. She had absolute ideas about who was right and what was wrong. Smoking was on her no, never list. No boy who ever smoked asked her on a date, and no girl who ever smoked was invited to a slumber party. She ended up in college with a roommate who smoked. Laura wanted to quit, sort of, and she was in a no-smoking room because her parents did not know that she smoked. For Valentine's Day, Tricia spent $25 on gum and candy, which she put in strategic spots all around their dorm room, with notes reading, "Try a stick of gum instead of a stick of cancer." And at the end of that year, they were reasonably good friends. Laura still smoked, but they never lived together again. And Tricia is still just as judgmental about tobacco. Once, when walking into a grocery store, her 3-year-old daughter, Hannah, walked right up to a man standing outside the door smoking and said, "Too bad for your lungs, you're going to be really sick one day." Tricia had already been teaching her that smoking was not a good choice. Now, I'm going to interject here and say that I had seen a non-smoker and smoker's lung in 10th grade biology, and I think that might have set my tone. Back to my mother's words. I grew up in a judgmental time, the 40s and the 50s, and in a very judgmental place, small town, Midwestern America. We were judgmental about divorces and girls who got pregnant without a husband, and anyone who was not a virgin on their wedding day. Commies were the big bad guys, and anyone who disagreed with the good guys were called red or pinkish. And even the label was enough to ruin and destroy careers or lives. In many ways, it was a terrible time. For a while, we were much less judgmental, at least on the surface. Divorces are acceptable, so we have a lot more of them. The pendulum is swinging back, at least in politics and family values, which seems to mean being more judgmental gets the votes. To be or not to be judgmental. I feel like I've argued myself into a circle which goes nowhere. It is wrong to be judgmental. I believe that as strongly as Paul does. I am not wise enough nor good enough to judge the ethical behavior of others. Only God knows. I pray that my mom has had a personal audience with God to debate this conundrum. My adult Sunday school has just finished reading and discussing this book, Take This Bread, by Sarah Miles. She was raised atheist, didn't go to college, became a cook, then a journalist covering the Nicaraguan wars. She landed in San Francisco in the mid-80s, and with the curiosity of a journalist, walked into St. Greg's Episcopal Church just to see what goes on in there. She ends up taking communion and is converted. The entire book is about her conversion and the food pantry that she starts at that church, and how the food that she gives away is so like communion. She shares so many examples of opportunities to be judgmental. And then, like my mom, looks at their situation and their life and their need from another viewpoint, one that she can't imagine. So she sits with them, and she listens to their horror stories, and she does not judge, but gives them a bag of groceries. To be or not to be judgmental. It's a personal question for me, but it's also a question for our churches and for our society, the society that we live in. The societal judgment pendulum has swung throughout all of our lives. World War I led to the Roaring '20s. World War II conservative values swung into the 60s and 70s of free love. The 2000s brought uncertainty. Terrorist acts brought on a new target of judgmentalism, but it was the same old theme: prejudice. Someone like you was bad, therefore you are bad. We elected our first African American president. We thought we were bridging the gap. And now, now I stop and sigh, and I wonder how we can be so far left and so far right, so judgmental of those that that have differing opinions, so far to one side or the other that we can't see from the other person's viewpoint. To be or not to be judgmental? No, says Paul, and again, no. Why? Because we do not live to ourselves and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. For to this end Christ died and lived again, so that he might be the Lord both of the dead and the living. And then Paul goes on to ask, why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? Why do you despise your brother or sister? Paul doesn't try to answer this question, but he does tell us why we should not pass judgment, why we should not despise our brother or sister, no matter how terrible they seem to be. For, says Paul, we will all stand before the judgment of God, and then each of us will be accountable to God. As I mentioned earlier, my dad smoked a pipe. He was a smoker. He lit it up when he was contemplating something and needed to have a few minutes to gather his thoughts. He enjoyed the ritual of the pipe. And so who am I to judge his choice or his behavior? I loved him. And in the future, I will do my best to be accepting and loving of those who make that same choice. I struggle with the fine line between being judgmental and seeking social justice. Does God expect us to hold each other accountable for social justice, or does that just make us judgmental? A no-no, according to Paul. When we see or hear something that is clearly wrong, we are being taught to confront it, to confront them. But by doing that, does that make us judgmental? I don't have the answers, but can only hope that I can do better myself, or at least catch myself when I have judgmental thoughts and also ask for God's forgiveness. I have one last story from my mom. A rancher friend told me about seeing a hawk swoop down and pick up a big bull snake. They struggled together just above the ground. The hawk killed the snake, all right, but in the process, it also died. The hawk's talons and beak tore apart the snake, but at the same time, the snake slowly squeezed the life out of the hawk. Either could have let go, and they might have escaped, but neither did. That's what happens to judgmental people. We try to destroy the less righteous and sometimes succeed. But in the process, we are spiritually squeezed to death by our own self-righteousness. Of course, it is good and right for me to be judgmental when I confront someone destroying physically or emotionally or spiritually another human being, even themselves. And it is good and right for me to be judgmental of myself when I find myself squeezing in any way the spirit or soul of another human being. But still, to be or not to be judgmental? Yes, that is the question, and only God can help us with the answer. Will you pray with me? O God, who was and is and will ever be, you are the author, the source, the creator of all that is. You are here now in this place. Your steadfast love is as sure as the air we breathe, and yet it is so easy to despair. We are lonely and discouraged. We ache physically and spiritually. We are tempted to be judgmental of others, even while we let anything go in our own lives. We yearn, O Lord, for you. Come to us in the silence. Let us feel deep down. Let us experience for sure your steadfast love and healing power. In the name and spirit of Jesus Christ, amen.